The amazingly patient, dignified and exemplary leadership shown by the First Nations women and men all over this country who have led us towards the very real possibility of a change in the constitution of this nation. That would be constitutional recognition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the potential establishment at last of a voice to Parliament where their interests can be fairly represented. If we want to think about leadership, which we are thinking about this evening, we can put our hands and our hearts together and bow deeply, deeply to those brothers and sisters. We have a very simple format for this evening. We also have quite exceptional speakers. We're going to begin with music. I think this is a wonderful way of coming into the presence of one another and also listening with our hearts open as well as our minds. We will then hear from each of our speakers, and then we will have some questions among ourselves, and then another musical interlude, and then questions from you. So if you think of questions as we are speaking or as anybody is speaking, make sure that it really is a question and that it's relevant and succinct. And your questions will be very, very welcome. Our topic this evening, of course, is both inspiring and very complex. We're talking about women and leadership in what are undoubtedly troubled times. They're troubled times in so many different directions, not least because a whole phase of idealism that came from the civil rights movement and from the second wave of the women's movement has to some extent at least been challenged or even in some ways lost. And yet we have to hold on to that idealism. And that is perhaps one of the things that humanitarian activism and also spiritual activism can give us, plus the chance to come together and reinforce the notion that idealism is not separate from what we can or should achieve. It's the way forward. It's the lighting of the way forward. Unless we are ready to make our ideals realized, then we really go backwards. So to begin our evening and to open our hearts as well as our minds, I want to introduce you to my very good friend, Heather Lee, the visionary soprano, who has been inspiring many of us for years. She will be accompanied by Professor Kim Cuneo, who leads the School of Music here at the ANU and is known to many of you, and who is Heather's partner in life as well as in music, and who has been central with Gabriel Martin. Gabriel, wave your hand, in making this lovely event happen. So Heather, thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So the first selection tonight is written by the Spanish king, King Alfonso el Sabio, Spanish king, and so he was living in the second half of the 13th century. And this song is called Virgen Madre Glorioso, which honors the Virgin Mother. And there's one thing that this composer was famous for in his time and now is that he cut the military budget in the time and put that money into the University of Salamanca.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was beautiful. And Kim, that was beautiful. Very beautiful. We have to think about leader, the word leader, more than ships, really. Where does music lead us? Sometimes music leads us where otherwise only silence could, beyond words. Although there were words, we were experiencing them as music. So thank you so much, both of you. I asked each of the speakers this evening to consider the challenge of thinking about leadership, obviously, but also the extent to which we can really bring gender into the picture in a serious way still, when we have so many examples of how complicated this whole question of female has become. Is there any such thing as female leadership? Can we talk about that in any sensible way, or even in an insensible way? I'm not quite sure. And also to make the topic even more interesting and actually much more relevant to most of you who are here, the extent to which each of the speakers has been shaped by her religious or spiritual formation. Each of us has experienced leadership from others. We've experienced the positives and we've experienced the negatives. And then we also have our own series of questions to ourselves, how in the smallest or largest ways, we are ourselves an example of leadership. This is quite a confronting self-question, I think, also. So I'm not quite sure how our speakers will address this, and they may address something quite different, and that's marvelous too. Now, you will have noticed that we have two speakers this evening instead of three, that Professor Karima Lachia is unable to be with us. She's unwell, and in her considerate way was very unwilling to come in case we were affected by her unwellness. But I have some lovely words from her, and I want to share those with you. Now, I should just tell you, first of all, for those of you who don't know her, that she is the director of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies here at the ANU. And I must say, I would be very interested to attend courses at the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies. In fact, I would love to, Professor Cuneo. Yes? Her academic interests encompass the interface between humanities and social sciences, as they should, exploring culture, arts, and activism in the Middle East and North Africa. She perceives the role of the Centre as fundamental in offering a better understanding of Muslim majority societies in the Middle East, as well as Muslim communities across Australia. She tells us that she is proud to be a Muslim Arab woman academic, aspiring to building bridges between communities in Australia and globally. And we must understand here also, which I'm pointing out the obvious to you, that those words attract so much stereotypical thinking that is reductive and dishonoring. So these are the words that Karima sent me to read and share with you, and I think they're very well worth hearing. She says, I wanted to explore briefly the concept of leadership in Islamic ethics. Now that's interesting to me already, in Islamic ethics, because each of our faiths has its ethics. some of which are common to all cultures, and some of which are quite distinct. I would say, though, one of the ethics of Islam is hospitality. That is very, very strong in Islamic ethics, which makes it even more disturbing that people from that faith are so often treated with great inhospitality. That's my thought. So I'm going to start again. I wanted to explore briefly the concept of leadership in Islamic ethics, which is based on the idea of humility, listening, and consultation. I'll say those words again, they're beautiful. Humility, listening, and consultation. I was coming to it from the perspective that leadership requires us to unlearn our privileges. I love that. Unlearn our privileges, which are, after all, conditioned, and our biases, so that we can actively listen to those around us who occupy different positions and/or are less privileged than we are. The humility of listening means the openness to be transformed and changed, which is a real challenge. The ideals of leadership that we need in our polarized contemporary world are those of reconciliation and finding common grounds, as against the prevalent divisiveness and populism which thrive on divide and rule of intranational communities and global communities. In other words, and here I'm bringing in my own voice for a moment, othering others, othering others. And religions have a role to play in healing the wounds of othering the others. Back to Karima again. We also need to bring back the ideals of compassion and empathy, particularly when it comes to the plights of refugees fleeing wars and violence. I also wanted to question the stereotype about women in Islam and their presumed oppression and passivity, as my research on women leadership in Muslim majority societies is ripe with examples of women leaders offering fantastic models of leadership, focusing on grassroots alliances that defy sectarian and communitarian politics, usually instigated by the state ruling elites and Western interventions in the region, which is, of course, we could all agree, I think, a problem of power, of radical misuse of power. It's women who actively fight these divisive politics in the Middle East through building interfaith coalitions that offer services and help to other citizens, whatever their sect, gender, religion, or ethnicity. And then a little later on, she and I had a beautiful exchange, and we discussed whether gender is enough to be thinking about. I was arguing it wasn't. And she says, yes, gender is not enough, absolutely not enough. And yes, we do need intersectional interrogating at every turn, using your words, meaning my words, meaning that we would bring together questions not of gender only, but also of social class, of calculated poverty, and everywhere questions of race. Everywhere questions of race. We are all conditioned by assumptions around all those factors: gender, sexuality, culture, but almost above everything, race. In fact, says Karima, and I've nearly finished, I have serious concerns about the way gender is weaponized. In other words, the way that gender is used so that, let's say the board of a big corporation will say, hey ho ho, we've got 20% of women on our board, and we're a very successful company, but the women are required to uphold and actively support the same values as their colleagues. In other words, the values of profit before people. And we also know that the addition of women does not necessarily transfer that into a more acceptable form. She says, I have serious concerns about the way gender is weaponized and the terrible effects it has on creating solidarity at workplaces and society at large. In my workplace, which I believe is this university, we made huge progress in gender equity, but it has not translated in meaningful inclusivity and equality, particularly of Indigenous and non-white minorities. I lived in the UK for 22 years, she tells me. I also lived in the UK for 16 years. And I saw also firsthand the legacy of Thatcher in the UK, which I've been reflecting on. And she says, to finish, I prefer Merkel's legacy in Germany. So she gave us so much to think about there. And I'm very, very sorry that she's not here. However, she was very enthusiastic that we would take this discussion further. And I hope that when we do, you will join us again. So, to our second speaker. Our second speaker is a true global leader who possibly rather envies the Catholic Trappist vow of stability, which means staying in one place. As she must seldom be in one place for more than a few weeks ever. I first met B.K. Sister Japti about 20 years ago, maybe more than 20 years ago. And since then, I have met her again with great pleasure and always learning so much from her in India, the UK, and on several visits here to Australia. She is now the additional administrative head of the worldwide spiritual organization that we know as the Brahma Kumaris. And I want to explain to you that this organization is perhaps uniquely distinguished by the fact that when it was established and ever since, it is the one global organization in the world that is always led by women. Always led by women. I am sure that doesn't solve every problem, but it is a very interesting concept. And some of you might want to hear more about it or even ask a question about that. Sister Janti has just returned from the Spirit of Humanity Forum in Iceland, of which the Brahma Kumaris is one of the founding partners. Now that's very interesting, the Spirit of Humanity. I love that, Spirit of Humanity. A group of 120 leaders from 27 countries and from all continents participated. It was the 6th such forum, and this year the theme was Healing a World in Crisis. I think we need a decade, a century of healing our world in crisis, and we have to take it as an urgency, because we are not only healing a physical world that is in crisis, we are healing social worlds that are also in crisis. And a great deal of this crisis goes unacknowledged. For the first time, the forum took the form of a retreat using its 3 pillars of silence, listening, and dialogue. I'm just coming back to those words that Karima shared, humility, listening, and consultation. How beautifully similar. And emphasizing at the forum the question, how shall we be, rather than what can be done? Because of course the doing has to emerge from the being. Who are we before what can we do? So I'm very happy to introduce you to Sister Janti, who will speak to us for 10 or 15 minutes. Thank you.
A greeting of peace to my sisters and my brothers. Om Shanti. And firstly, thank you to Kim and Heather for setting the tone of this sacred evening. Much appreciate what you've done for us. Thank you. And Stephanie, thank you for that very, very warm introduction. And I remember a situation in which Brahma Kumaris were having a program that ran for quite a long time, and it continues in its own way now. And that was taking up the theme of values. And what we had decided was that each session would be a person from our own group, but also a person who would be from another tradition. And so one day it was someone from Catholicism, another day it was someone from Buddhism, and so forth. And the day that I was speaking, I was asked to speak on the subject of justice. And the person I was speaking at was a leader of the Islamic tradition who lives in London. And when we had our meeting pre the program, I was very interested to see that, in fact, both our ideas were so similar. And so it strikes me that sometimes we think that our traditions are very, very different. And yes, they have many aspects of diversity, and that's beautiful. But also I see that the thing that brings us together are the values that we share, because these are spiritual values, and spiritual values are at the heart of each and every tradition. The second thing that I wanted to mention was some research that had been done at Coventry University by a man called Professor Mike Hardy. And he was sharing with us the fact that they looked into the whole subject of leadership and researched it in many different ways. And they came up with 4 aspects of leadership that are important. Firstly, that a leader wouldn't be thinking about their own benefit, but they would be thinking about benefit for others. And the second was, and it'll make you smile because it'll one day make you wonder what's happened to the world. It's become truly topsy-turvy. That leaders walk their talk. Yes. Makes you laugh, doesn't it? But yes, what it is that makes a true leader is someone who walks their talk. And the third aspect, that they always fulfill their promises. Certainly it makes me smile. And the fourth aspect was that they would be inclusive, which means they wouldn't be discriminatory against any individual or any group. And I found that these 4 aspects are deeply spiritual, because it's only with spiritual power that you can truly allow your own personal needs to be fulfilled. And through that fulfillment within yourself, then yes, you have the capacity to be able to serve others and take care of others and think of benefit for others. And where there isn't that in a spiritual capacity, it's very difficult, because my needs, or I would say my wants, take over. It's not so much my needs, but it's my wants. Mahatma Gandhi had said many, many years ago that if all of us could simply think about each one's needs, then yes, the earth's resources are plentiful. but when even one or a few begin to think about greed, then of course nothing is going to be enough. And so I'm thinking also about the state of the environment and what has happened as a result of all of this. So that's again something to consider. Again, with spiritual power, I see that I'll walk my talk. Otherwise, yes, I can have wonderful expressions of eloquent words, but if I'm not able to actually do what it is I'm saying, then you can't win people's trust. And I think this is a factor that applies across the world today. There's a huge gap of trust between leaders and all others, and it applies on every level, whether it's the corporate leaders, whether it's the political leaders or any other leaders, the breakdown that's happened. And where we think about fulfilling promises made, to be able to have a vision that inspires me to make a promise, and then not only to just keep it at the vision, but to actually action it, then again, I need an inner power, which I think people haven't understood really, because we've moved very, very far away from spirituality. In a world that's dominated by consumerism and materialism, it feels as if we've lost touch with that which is sacred within ourselves. And so when the Brahma Kumaris started, it was with one man's vision, and his vision was of a better world. And that led him to surrender all his assets and create a group of women who would, because as he was sharing his ideas, it was happening over a space of several months. And as he was sharing those visions, many, many gathered around him. This was in what was India at that time, but Sindh, which is now in Pakistan. But it was in that region. And what he did was to surrender everything he had into the hands of a group of women, creating a trust so that then they would be responsible. And it would be even unusual today, never mind in the 30s, and in particular in the subcontinent. So you can see that he was a bit of a revolutionary. In his vision, he had understood that it was important to have equality. If you want to have a world of truth, of justice, then one of the foremost aspects of that is equality. And he thought about the situation in society where he was living, and he understood that there'd been a huge amount of discrimination, and women were not really considered worthy of any equality, but they were second-class citizens. And so he decided that that side of society, which hadn't been given an opportunity, should be given that opportunity of becoming teachers and leaders. And so this was his first step in making that happen. But the other thing that he understood also was that if you want to create a better world, then it begins by a change of heart, a change of consciousness, which happens through spiritual education. We have many, many universities doing amazing things, but a university that could focus on spirituality and understanding that was what was needed. And along the way, he also understood that if you want people to change, then it has to be with a huge amount of sustenance that can nurture that transformation. And so he decided that it would be women who would be the teachers who could help others have that nurture and sustenance. And so this is what led to the Brahma Kumaris coming to a constitution whereby we have women as leaders, but also important to notice that we don't just cater for women, because there must be many organizations that are women's organizations led by women, but rather an organization that would serve men and women, but within that it would be women who would be the leaders. And thankfully, there hasn't been any discrimination on the other levels, so that then we have a person like our brother Charles, who's the coordinator and the director of activities here nationally in Australia. So where there is that caliber, then of course the doors are open. So many issues that we face in the world. And how do we resolve all of these things, or even some of these things? For me, the essence is the whole subject of values. And the question is, where do values lie? Yes, we acquire values as we grow up. We imbue values from our home upbringing, from the education we receive, and whether it's primary school, secondary school, university, and whatever. But where do they reside? It's not a physical thing. Love, peace, truth, joy, honesty. These values reside within the spirit itself, within the soul. And so until I'm in contact with myself, I won't say my soul, because when I, the soul, am speaking, I can say my body. But if I say my soul, who is speaking? So it's I, the soul, who speaks through this physical vehicle of the body. And so when I connect with my own spiritual identity, then I'm tapping into the original and natural resource that lies within. And that means the values. And so it's not surprising that in a world that doesn't give much space to spirituality, when we were thinking about the Spirit of Humanity conference, and we started thinking about it about 10 years ago, or even before, the first event happened 10 years ago. And at that time, we thought that what we would like is for people to be aware that the speciality of humanity is the spirit. And we were totally aware that spirituality wasn't a word that would be appreciated. But we thought that, well, maybe you'll try the word spirit. And to our pleasant surprise, people responded very, very favorably. And within that, and that's where I first met Mike Hardy, we were asking people to share, and they were all leaders, what is it that you feel is your own faith tradition, and how has it helped you in the work that you're doing? We know that you've done amazing things, achieved, accomplished many successes, but do you feel that your faith tradition has been an intrinsic part of that energy that made things happen? And so we very consciously found people who could speak to that. And so this has been one of the beautiful things that has evolved over these years. And when we thought about a retreat, we thought, well, we don't have big names to publicize a retreat, because that's what a retreat is all about. How are we going to have people come to this? And of course, the publicity was just simply through the network that had been built up, and by word of mouth through the people who were connected. And 120 powerful individuals came together. One of the highlights of all of this was the Prime Minister of Iceland. She's a woman, Christine, look on the surname. It ends with Dottir, because most Icelandic names end with Dottir. But Christine. So Christine was speaking about there was an interview with her, and she couldn't come because she was suddenly called away because of the Ukraine crisis. She had to go somewhere. So she did a recording of an interview for us. And within that, she spoke about how it's so important for leaders to make time for themselves, to have time for silence, so that there could be self-reflection. And through that, there could perhaps be decisions that would be more in keeping with what the world needs at the present time. It's a 20-minute interview, and at some point it will be on the website of Spirit of Humanity, but I'm not sure whether it's there yet, but it's on the way. But there's another interview on that website by Christiana Figueres, and she speaks about her own change of heart and change of awareness regarding her personal situation that led her to continue her work with being the executive secretary of the climate change conferences, and that led to the Paris Agreement. So here are two women leaders who've both touched upon the whole subject of personal transformation and values being the basis for creating a better world in different ways, but definitely a better world. I was interested to hear of Professor Karina's point about whose legacy do we honor, and I would totally agree that it's Mrs. Merkel's legacy that's very, very valuable. I won't comment on the other. No. No need. History speaks for itself. It really does. I have to say that sometimes we found that women have to be much, much better than men to be able to come to a situation of some type of leadership. A person could have an MA and could become a leader, but it's probably a man. A woman holding the same position would have to have a PhD before she's given that position. That's a very general statement, but it gives you an idea of what's happening. And so it becomes so that, and not just in terms of education and university qualifications, but I know that they used to say that the best man we have in the Tory party is Margaret Thatcher. And so it gives you an idea of how to compete in a world which is very much a patriarchal society. Women have sometimes thought that they have to develop their masculinity. The interesting thing about looking at things from a spiritual perspective is that one can experience oneself as a spiritual being, and one knows that spirit is actually without gender. Gender is associated with the body and all the problems that we now face today. But in terms of spirit, spirit has both masculine and feminine qualities. And of course, the beautiful thing is to be able to learn to balance both of these within our own being so that we can express the highest of both aspects. Because you have the highest within the masculine, the courage, the strength, and so forth, decision-making. And then in women, you have the care, the compassion, the love to a great extent. But you find that there are some men and some women who are able to combine both, and they have been recognized as being great leaders. Mother Teresa comes to mind, in which she had to battle with the bureaucracy of the Vatican to be able to come to India and do the service that she did. She writes about it in her diaries. It was a real battle for her, but she persevered. She had the courage and the strength to carry out whatever was her vision, which was, of course, of care and compassion. But somebody like Mahatma Gandhi, again, you saw his courage and bravery, but at the same time, he displayed his feminine side of great love and concern for non-violence. And so I see that we do have people who are sometimes doing this, but I feel that if there's more emphasis on spirituality and spiritual education, then I think all of us would be able to move in that direction and allow that which is the highest of both aspects to develop and emerge, and we share that within our own life and activity. So these are a few thoughts about leadership, but also about what's going on in the world and how through spirituality we come back to our original values, those values that are intrinsic within every human being. On one level, I would say every human being does have goodness, no question about that, but we forget to access it. And so silence, meditation, a spiritual path, whichever spiritual path allows us to connect with that so that it can then come through in our life. Whether it's a question of leadership, whether it's a question of the environment, whether it's a question of the economy that fluctuates so wildly today, or the social ills that we're surrounded by, whether it's addictions, obsessive behavior, all sorts of things, I feel that spirituality has the answer, because it's through that change of heart and awareness in which I come back to that truth which lies within, and the wisdom that lies within, that can then guide me, and it can help me out of all the situations that we see around us. Thank you.
Well, that gave us so much to think about. And I think maybe 8 or 9 years ago, I wrote and published a book called Seeking the Sacred, and I had at the very front of it a quote from Jung, Carl Jung, who said the world is desacralized. And actually, until we come back to thinking of life, all of life, the being of life as something sacred, we will not protect it. So I think that what Sister Janti has just said to us is actually quite profound and goes also to the leadership that we offer to ourselves. How are we leading ourselves? This is such a poignant and beautiful question, and we should meet it really with courage, because we have so much inspiration on offer. That is one of the remarkable features of our time. We have many features of our time that we could despair about, but one of the great features of our time, and Kim Cunio and I share this very much, is that we have available to us the wisdom of all the traditions. For the first time in human history, we have available to us the wisdom of all the traditions. It's a marvelous, marvelous thing. I'm going to introduce you now to Professor Kim Rubenstein, who some of you will know. She is a lawyer, an academic, an author, human rights advocate, and widely admired in Australia as a champion of equal opportunity and active citizenship. I love that, Kim. She is a professor in the Faculty of Business, Government and Law at the University of Canberra and an honorary professor here at the ANU. She is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Science and the Australian Academy of Law. Now, these are the interesting bits. She's a sixth-generation Australian, a descendant of one of the first Jewish convicts, Henry Cohen, and was eventually the Jewish school captain of the Presbyterian Ladies' College. What a glorious moment of interfaith reconciliation that was. Kim is influenced, as I have also been, by a very famous statement from Rabbi Hillel of the first century. This is something that might be familiar to some of you and is really worth thinking about almost every day. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Thank you, Kim.
I was trying to get up just to get a little bit more warm. You
You might have been in Iceland, but it certainly feels like Iceland in here, doesn't it? So hopefully we'll warm you up a little bit. So I thought I would begin in my reflections and provocations from Stephanie to place some of that information that you've just shared into a context of thinking about identity and leadership. And in thinking about identity, I think our lived experiences become so fundamental to forming our identities. And by that I mean we do need to unpack and think through various experiences in our lives that influence the way in which we view the world. I mean, we are all sitting in this room tonight and we'll all be privy to the same information. But I guarantee that if someone were to interview each of us after this evening, there will be vastly different stories about this event. And I'm not just giving a criminal evidence class here, it's just about the fact that we see the world through our own lived experiences. And so that I think is fundamental to thinking about the ways we view leadership and also about the way we view gender. And to unpack that gender box just a little bit more, there is much discussion about the biological nature of gender. But I think there is an undisputed reality that the society in which we live and societies over time have created gendered expectations. Expectations in terms of values, so that if we see someone like Margaret Thatcher acting in a way that we don't think is consistent with feminine values, we are much harsher on her than we would be on a male. So that's just one sense in terms of gendered expectations of the ways in which we relate to the world. But then there are also the gendered expectations of our roles in society, and that traditionally women's place in leadership roles has been minimal, and that the only vision that we have, or the predominant vision that we have had of leadership, has been of men who have practiced certain styles of leadership. But not all men necessarily do that, and we can think ourselves, thinking of the wonderful professor leader Kim Cuneo here, about the variety of different ways in which we can be inspiring leaders that are not necessarily reflected by other male professors, for instance, in the university. So we know enough, but there are aspects that I might say very provocatively that I see as unusual about Professor Kim Cuneo that shouldn't be unusual, in the sense that we should expect from all leaders a willingness to be truthful to themselves rather than to fit themselves into an expectation of what the role represents. There are just a few things to start stimulating that discussion. But from my own perspective, I think growing up as a Jewish girl in a non-Jewish school environment was actually very helpful. Helpful in terms of no expectations because of my gender in terms of my professional future. All girls at the school, a Presbyterian ladies' college, were encouraged to fulfill their own interests. So there were science students and there were humanities students, there were the artists, there were the dancers, there were the musicians. We could see within our own cohort the diversity of a woman's life experience because there were many. And we had a woman principal modelling leadership. Joan Montgomery, who some of you, if you've grown up in Melbourne, may remember, who so inspired me that I've written a biography about her because of her capacity to show leadership during a time of struggle within, would you believe, the breakdown of the Presbyterian Church in Australia that had a ramification. And so the Nice Jewish Girl has written a book about the way the church fought over Joan Montgomery's position. So that experience of being not only a Jewish girl in a non-Jewish environment, but her modelling of leadership, where in recognition of being a Jewish school captain, she was thoughtful about my role in only reading from my Bible or the Old Testament in school assemblies. Little things that recognised difference and affirmed difference. But the Hillel
quote was very powerfully represented to me at the age of 15 in the school, when we had also an inspiring politics teacher. And it was 1980. It was an election year. And so she thought a wonderful way to teach us about politics would be to run an election. And each class became an electorate. And we formed 3 different parties, of which I was elected the leader of the United Australia Party, would you believe, before we knew what that actually represented. And in that process, we developed campaign speeches. We had a TV channel where the girls would be behind the camera, and we gave a speech each to the class, and the vote occurred. And lo and behold, the United Australia Party, of which I was leader, got the most seats. But there was one problem. I lost my own seat. And in reflecting, it made me think about Hillel's quote, "If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when?" And I'd lost sight of myself in seeking out for the good of the greater good. But I think that message that's come through, I think, already several times, is about the importance of self-knowledge and of protecting oneself in the sense of our own identities and our own health and well-being is profound and fundamental, and is a starting point before we then act in the interests of the many. And in many ways, I think it is finding that right balance that is a pressing need in our society, and that our leaders at the moment are erring on the side of protecting one's own power, rather than seeing that of course is important to a degree, but that is fundamental to be doing that for the purpose of using that power not over others, but to benefit others. And I think that in many ways, the gendered expectations of women in society have largely focused on that responsibility, that we have been taught to be nurturers and carers, but we need all human beings to be nurturers and carers. And so in terms of leadership and perhaps as a prompt for our further discussion, I think it is really important to think about the role of gender, but in terms of structures and expectations and the ways that we might start to alter the frameworks of power in society, whether it be in our parliament or whether it be in our university settings, that have largely been hierarchical and have been about singular expressions of power. The Prime Minister, the Attorney General, the Governor General, or singular roles. And that one of the things that I'm interested in pursuing and working on more is about shared leadership. And what better way to think about shared leadership but starting from the home, starting from the shared responsibility of caring in society, from the moment of birth through the moment of parents, of the ways in which, if we look around during COVID, it was women who largely shouldered that caring responsibility, and that leadership should be about men taking on equally those roles in society, and that we need to start talking more about men's roles in encouraging an equality of membership and of leadership. So I'll leave it at that to get them all right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kim. You gave me a lovely prompt, actually, to not just remember, but to honour that leadership is not only about people that we could call leaders. Sometimes the most vital leadership just comes from a small moment of inspiration that the other person may not even know that they are sharing. So in that sense, each one of us is a leader. You could look at us and think, oh, well, these women have all worked hard and studied hard and, you know, probably had the odd, you know, person going clap, clap, and so on and so on. And yes, that's true. But each one of us is a leader. And while Kim was speaking, I remembered a moment of epiphany in my own life that was absolutely transformative. I remember where I was standing in my grandmother's house. I think I was somewhere between 14 and 15. And my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who'd had a very, very hard life. Her parents had been missionaries to India. She was born in India. She wasn't Indian, although the first time she came from New Zealand via Australia, they had the White Australia policy, so they she had difficulty coming to Australia on her way to Europe, but that's another story. Although it's part of the same story. She had a very difficult life, and she'd been a widow for quite a long time by this moment when I was 14 or 15. And she was explaining to me, I'm a post-war child. I think Sister Janti is also. We're probably similar in this way. And it's hard for younger people to imagine how powerful the war still was, even for those of us born some years later. It was vivid in so many ways. And my grandmother was explaining to me that in the First World War, her husband, my grandfather, whom I barely remembered, had chosen to be a pacifist and to work on hospital ships rather than fighting. And that was an epiphany moment for me, in the sense that I then saw that we have choices. I saw in a new way that we have choices, because of course the fighting in both those wars had to be heroic to meet fascism. But the whole history of how things are built up so that you get to a moment of war really needs to be interrogated by every single generation. And from that moment until this moment, as I stand with you here on the 20th of June 2023, I have seen myself as a peace activist. I'm a humanitarian activist, a women's activist, and so on and so on and so on. But at the heart of it all is, how do we live in harmony with one another? Not avoiding any disagreements, but not either killing or slaughtering or othering around them. Of course we will have disagreements. We're a diverse family, but we are a family. We are one family, one human family, and we have to find a way to live together in a state that we could call peace, which may not be the absence of all disagreement, but it would be the absence of utter violence. So my grandmother was the instrument in that moment of telling me something about my long deceased grandfather, who was for me a leader. I hope that makes sense to you, because, and when you go home tonight, you will think of many moments where you might not know you were a leader for somebody, or somebody else was a leader for you, but really set you on a path that was more than just destiny. It was a path in which you could discover yourself. Now Heather's going to sing for us again, which is very welcome and very lovely. And while Heather sings, those of you who want to have a question for either Sister Janti or for Kim, please make a little note or think about it in your head, and be very willing to ask. Heather.
I'm going to sit down.
bows and flows of angel hair, and ice cream castles in the air, and feathered canyons everywhere. I've looked at clouds that way. But now they only block the sun. They rain and snow on everyone. So many things I would have done, but clouds got in my way. I've looked at clouds from both sides now, from up and down, and still somehow it's clouds' illusions I recall. I really don't know clouds at moons and Junes and Ferris wheels, the dizzy dancing way you feel as every fairy tale comes real. I've looked at love that way, but now it's just another show. You leave them laughing when you go, and if you care, don't let them know. Don't give yourself away. I've looked at love from both sides now, from give and take, and still somehow it's love's illusions I recall. I really don't know love at all. Tears and fears and feeling proud to say I love you right out loud. Dreams and schemes and circus crowds. I've looked at life that way, but now old friends, they're acting strange. They shake their heads, they say I've changed. Well, something's lost and something's gained from living every day. I've looked at life from both sides now, from win and lose, and still somehow it's life's illusions I
Thank you.
I'm going to just ask a question on behalf of Professor Karima, who wasn't here and who asked me to ask this question. And I'm also going to ask him, do you have a question for Sister Janti? Would you? No, you go first.
Sister Janti, in your travels, do you find that there are distinctive country cultural approaches to gender that have been striking to you?
It's amazing because what I did notice very early on, maybe when I first traveled to the Philippines, was how strong the women were. And so, thank you. And so, yes, definitely, there are very distinct cultural differences connected with gender. I've seen that.
The cultural differences affect not just gender, but how we think, how we position ourselves in the world. And you talked about identity, Kim, and our identity is something so complicated because so much of it is conditioned. And yet we also have marvelous chances throughout our lives to throw off some of that conditioning and come to who we are. And one of the beautiful things about identifying first as a soul is that you can discover more about the personality because you're not just addicted to it, or you know that that's not all that you are. It's a kind of freedom, I think. But it's a freedom that's a little bit hard to grasp at first. And maybe you'll speak about that in a moment. I'm going to ask you this question from Karima. My question to Sister Janti is how she sees the role of spirituality in fighting communal violence in India, particularly the horrific Islamophobia directed at Muslim masses in the country. This is a very painful question to be asking and a very true and real question to be asking. Shall I say it again? Did you all understand? It's about Hindu nationalism. And that, of course, is the dark side of a glorious tradition, as all fundamentalisms are the shadow of glorious traditions. So, thank you.
Yes, it's true that all the things that Karima is saying are the things that are happening in India at this moment. And perhaps it's easier for me to see that being at a distance from India. Maybe if I was still living in India, part of India, in that way on a day-to-day basis, I wouldn't be able to be so clear about it. But distance definitely brings that detachment in which you have a clearer picture of what's going on. So unfortunately, it is the case. But I do think that the only way out of that is spirituality. Because with spirituality, I recognize the goodness of every human being, and I connect with them in a way that's above race, gender, religion, caste, or any of these external factors. So I would agree totally.
It's your turn now. Yes, it's your turn now. So you are very welcome to come and ask a succinct question of either of our speakers. Happy to hear. would you like to come and speak into the microphone? Would that feel awkward or? Okay, good. Okay. For giving us such a
just wanted to know in leadership is different at different levels, like in a government or in a workplace, in a family. So there is things say that the leadership is learned from home. So how do you think that we should, as a woman, do that in our home first?
Since the mic is here, I'll take it first. The meditation I practice is called Raj Yoga, and the word Raja, sovereign, master, leader. And in fact, the first step of leadership begins with knowing myself, and through that awareness, being able to be the master of my own thoughts and feelings. And through that awareness and understanding, allow my conscience to guide me rather than my emotions to guide me. And also I see how our emotions get the better of our conscience so often. And in that case, then my conscience is clear. I understand what I need to do, but my emotions take over, whether it's anger or greed, whatever it may be, some negative force. And I see that when there's this discrepancy, then we lose trust in ourselves. There's lack of self-esteem. And I see that as being a basic issue for identity at the present time. Lack of self-esteem for men and women, but also especially for women, because they've been pushed down so often and told, no, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other. No, it's not your job to be thinking like that or that. So that, I feel, is the factor that has to be rectified. When a woman comes back in touch with herself and can stand in her own dignity, then there's a very different approach to being a parent. Then it's not an issue of controlling children. Sometimes where I don't have control over other things, then in a very natural way to compensate, I then start controlling my children because I think they're mine. I can do that. But of course, it leads to many, many difficult issues for the child. And so I see how, as the woman comes back to her own values and self-respect and dignity, she's able to give the child both the upbringing that's needed in terms of guidance and discipline, but also the love and the ability to encourage and inspire the child to be able to do something higher for themselves. I don't mean in terms of passing exams only, because again, that's where many parents sort of get stuck, but to actually allow the child to develop and flourish in all directions.
So thank you for that question, and it gives me just an opportunity to extend a little more of what I was saying earlier. When I was doing some work with the 50/50 by 2030 Foundation at the University of Canberra, we developed a strategic plan which we called Share the Load, Share the Benefits, Share the Power. And I think it comes back to your question about leadership and linking it back to gender and leadership in the home. And that the only way we really are, I think, going to create a truly gender equal society is if we have that shared leadership in each of those spheres. So starting from the home, the leadership within the home as parents is about an equality of parenting, not to have gendered norms and expectations about roles for each of the parents, but rather each of the parents to determine themselves, their own skills and capacities, and the way as a family they can nurture each other without those expectations. And if we see that equality in caring in all aspects within the home, then there's going to be much more opportunity for each of those individuals within society more broadly to extend their own capacities and skills, so that you would then naturally see women in equal leadership roles, because the pathways have been set to enable that. So those people who want to take on the more formal leadership roles, because the structures of society have enabled them to do so. But I think it does require, in order to encourage that shared leadership in the home, you do need societal structures that support and enhance and promote that. And so economically speaking, we need a society which also encourages that, so that people are more free to be able to fulfill that, so that your financial frameworks where gendered roles, gendered workplaces are no longer a reality, so that we don't see that the caring professions are predominantly women, but equally men involved in teaching, in nursing, in all those aspects are so fundamental to society. If we had, and we nurtured our boys to also think of that as one of the many opportunities available to them in a positive way, that then would also flow on in terms of leadership in those ways. And for young girls to be thinking of construction and engineering in the way that boys do now, that each of those areas should be supported in a financially incentivized way to encourage that, because that is not the norm at the moment. So that we need to think through those financial incentives to support that normative vision. And by doing that, you would then also have more people in those leadership roles who would get that was important, to reinforce that, so that you would embed that as a norm in society. So I think the starting place is at home because of our expectations, and our expectations need to change so that leadership is there right from the start within parenting, to really nurture each member of the family in a way that is not bound by gendered expectations.
We have another question from somebody. Yes, please come. Could you come to the microphone, would you mind?
So, as you mentioned, I believe that the way that it was mentioned that the spirituality believes their leadership, and also you mentioned that it's important for the country or wherever we are living, so that leadership or that education is provided for men and women in order to begin and practice the leadership. What do you think of the role of the religions or religious leader in that way? An example, what I want to say is Iran, where the country or the leaders of the religious people, they say that the role of the woman is in the home, not in education, not at university or any other place. How can we fix those issues, and what are they?
Well, the how-to is a very difficult one, but I think it is fundamental to our capacity to move forward. And I think we're seeing that in religions around the world, that there are more and more women who are becoming educated in traditional texts. So if I look at my own knowledge within the Jewish world, of course, within the Jewish religion and practice, there are the more orthodox and there are the more progressive or liberal Jews. But even in the more orthodox environments, which had the more patriarchal, traditional gendered norms, we are seeing more and more women being educated and being taught the basic texts. And in being taught those basic texts, they're in a position to interrogate and critique those earlier gendered roles in a way that will hopefully over time lead to a dismantling of that, what I would say, non-fluid approach to the role of religion, so that the power dynamic at the moment of, in traditional terms, of the expectations that there are different roles for men and women will have to change in order for that to liberate society more generally.
like to add something there. If we think about the three most powerful countries in the world, which is probably the United States, China, and India, we could see that in each of them, and I think it's particularly marked in the United States because we are right to expect better of them, that the growing of the controlling of women is very much tied to Christian fundamentalism, and it's abhorrent. It's absolutely abhorrent. In great swathes of the United States, it is now impossible for young women, poor women, women of color, to access the health services that they may need. And the decisions around this are being made not only by men, but also by women who have a very, very strange view of what Christian life asks of them, and the valuing of pre-birth life while not valuing the lives of people already born. For me, coming from a Christian tradition, it's completely heartbreaking because it is the absolute reverse of the teacher, that the Jewish teacher, Jesus, who came to say, I care about everyone, and I care particularly passionately about the people on the margins. Come to me, all you who suffer and are burdened, and I will give you rest, he said. Yeah. So I think that we need to be very alert and unsentimental about the dangers of religious fundamentalism as opposed to political fundamentalism, because the danger, the specific danger with religious fundamentalism is that people believe they are speaking for God. And this is a tragedy. This is a tragedy. And I think we need to be very informed about it. Compassionate, yes, to people whose minds have been conditioned in these ways, but also passionate in our rebuttal that this is the right way. I believe it's not. Anything that excludes or dominates or threatens human life in those ways is not to be encouraged. So Iran is not the only country. Iran is not the only one. Yeah, maybe, yes, yes. Yes. Yes, I understand.
And I was wondering whether we, as the educated, should be believing in the human, and also our government also doing that. What can we do for them in order to become for that for those religious leaders to become aware of the problem that they are causing for not only that country, but also for humanity? Because the people are.
Yes, of course they are. Of course they are. They are our brothers and sisters, whoever they are, even those who hold the most abhorrent views. They are our brothers and sisters, whoever they are.
I'm not going to reply.
Sorry.
I'm not going to reply to your question at this point because I don't know how to change the minds of governments. But what I do want to say, and it might sound a chorus that I keep repeating, but where religion gets trapped by tradition sometimes, or even just by text, the word, rather than the spirit of what's being said, or rituals, all the external aspects of religion, where we get stuck into those things, there'll always be division. But if we can go to the heart of our tradition, on that inner journey that every tradition has spoken about, then we're going to be able to come to the understanding of values, which are not just spiritual values, but they're also human values. They're values which is the basis of civilization. And so I'm going to again say that, yes, we have to go on that inner journey, whatever our tradition may be, and through that discover our eternal identity and our own eternal values.
So that leads me to say that Sister Janti is going to guide us for a few minutes in meditation, which will really bring us back to ourselves and to our power to be more generous in the way that we not only take any leadership moments, but just our moments of gratitude for existence.
I'll share a few thoughts and invite you to follow those ideas. I'm sure many of you are used to silent prayer or meditation in some form, but try this. I reflect on the things I've been hearing about: equality, justice, love, generosity. And I take a moment to absorb the things that touched me deeply. And as I look inside, I see my thoughts. But now, as my thoughts reflect on these positive values that I've been hearing about, the speed of my thoughts has slowed down. And I can see my thoughts and select one strand, one thought. I select the thought of peace. And as I hold peace in my mind, I begin to feel peace within myself. I had been searching for peace outside, but now I can feel the peace that lies within. Staying connected with this inner state of peace, I can sense the presence of the divine. And my thoughts connect to the source of all positive attributes, the being who is absolute, the being without physical or even angelic form, the being of light, the source, the divine. And in this experience of the presence of the divine, connecting with the Supreme, from the source of love, the ocean of love pours out and touches our hearts. The pure, unconditional, non-judgmental love holds us together as one family, belonging to the one race of humanity, aware of the beauty of diversity, but aware that there is an eternal bond of love to which we are all connected. And as the love touches my heart, a process of healing begins. And equally, as love touches my heart expands. And in this connection with my human family, there is a love which is inclusive. And the power of this love reaches out and touches not only the human family, but also all forms of life. Each one of those species sacred. And as the love reaches out to them, they feel safe and secure, free from aggression. And the love reaches all the elements of nature, the earth, the air, the water, the plants, the trees. And as the love touches them, they return to a state of cleanliness, purity, and harmony. I stay connected with the power of this love. And as I come back to the awareness of the moment here and now in the physical dimension, I keep this love so that it can guide me in my thinking, my speaking, and my doing, because it's now there in my being. Om Shanti. Thank you.
I have a few people to thank. I want to thank you, of course, Sister Janti, that you made this time for us on your rapid visit to Australia. we are very, very grateful. And I want to thank you, Kim, whom I've looked forward to meeting for a long time, and how lovely it was, all that you brought. And thank you, Heather, for the beauty of your music that takes us beyond the words, always. A very special thank you to Professor Kim Cuneo, who is a very dear friend and has made this evening possible because he has such a strong attachment also to Berkman College, as well as to the messages of peace and hope that we've been sharing this evening. And I also want to thank Gabriel. Where is she? Oh, you're right there, right in front of me, Gabriel. Gabriel's worked so hard to make this the beautiful evening that it is. She's worked tirelessly and always with such grace. So thank you so much, Gabriel. Would you thank all those people, please? I want to thank you for coming also, because without you, we wouldn't have had our evening. And it's been a rich evening. And I want, before I just give you the final messages, I want you just to think, was there a particular word or a particular phrase that you heard this evening that really was for you in some way? Would you just make a little mental note, a word or a phrase that you will take home, that will resonate for you? We've heard from Sister Janti, particularly this evening, as a spiritual teacher, not only as a social commentator, and that's a very different thing and a very precious thing. And for those of you who would like to know more about Raja Yoga, which is the yoga of the mind, the connection to the infinite, to the immeasurable, to the one. And there is a local Raja Yoga meditation